Hi, everyone. This panel is, I have the distinct pleasure of, you guys can all take a seat. I'll have them introduce themselves. These are the members of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs from both Senator Murkowski and Senator Schatz's office. Before I turn this over to the panel, I'll share a really quick story. And one of the lessons that I learned from Senator Murkowski as I was leading CNHA and we were doing lots of advocacy in Washington, D.C. And what I learned from Senator Murkowski is that even when she had her mind made up about where she was going on legislation, she always made sure that people who were coming to her, and in this case, we were asking for her support of the Native Hawaiian language bill. She was sure to ask me if folks from the Alaska Federation of Natives were supportive of that bill. And so she was my teacher and mentor to say, she was sure that her constituency was in support of all the asks that were being made of her. And it was a great lesson for me as somebody who was going to Washington, D.C. on the value of the kind of partnership between two senators, that before, even though I knew she was supportive of the Native language bill, she was sure to make sure that I was reaching out to her constituents, so that we were always partnered together. And so that's something I will always remember about Senator Murkowski and her wonderful partnership in always supporting Hawaii and Hawaii to Alaska. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over. I think we have the leader of the committee chiming in from Washington, D.C., who will be joining us. And I'll have them all introduce themselves, and I'm going to turn it over to them to talk about what they're working on and some major legislation that they are focused on today. So thank you for being here, and I turn it over to you, Brianne.
Is Jennifer going to be joining us? Yes.
I'm here if folks can hear me.
Are you muted?
No.
There we go, we can see you.
Can you see me? Oh, hello, everyone. I am participating virtually from Washington, D.C. I understand that we're all systems go here, so I can begin my presentation. Yes. Excellent. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Romero. I'm the staff director and chief counsel of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. I represent Brian Schatz, the senior senator from Hawaii and chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us on today's panel discussion entitled Native Hawaiian Equities in the 118th Congress. I'm sorry I'm unable to join you all in person. I'm missing all of the fun and all the talk story happening in the hallways, but we have several committee staff joining you today in person, and I'd just like to go along down the line and introduce everyone individually. Representing Chairman Schatz and the Democrats on the committee, I have Brianne Nuhiva, who is the Deputy Staff Director, Lena Aoki, who is the General Counsel for the majority on the committee, Darren Modulewski, who is a Policy Advisor, and Manu Tupper, who is a Legislative Assistant and the Press Secretary. Representing Vice Chair Murkowski, we have Senior Senator from Alaska's staff, Republican committee staff. We have Amber Ebarb, who is my counterpart, that is the staff director for the Republicans on the committee, and Jacqueline Basili, who is a policy advisor for Senator Murkowski. So again, thank you so much to CNHA for the kind invitation and for hosting this conference. Also want to thank Michelle for her time for moderating. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. I know you have a lot of options in this breakout session, so thank you for your interest and participation. So with that, I'll begin the slideshow presentation. we have slide 2. If you could pull that up. Great, if everyone can see that. I wanted to give just a brief overview of the Senate and the committee structure. And you'll see there in the graph, the Senate, and just sort of a 101 civics lesson, just a reminder that Congress is comprised of two bodies, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate is called the upper chamber. It is comprised of 100 senators, 2 representing each state, including Hawaii, as you know. Each of these senators serve 6-year terms. Both Senator Schatz and Senator Murkowski were just reelected last year, so they have another 6 years under their belt, thankfully. Now, each of the 100 senators serve on committees. Committees are essential to the operation of the Senate as a whole. Through committees, investigations, hearings, and other events, the committees gather information on national and international problems within their jurisdictions. The chair of each committee and a majority of its members represent the majority party. In the 118th Congress, the Democrats are the majority party. The chair, Chairman Schatz of Hawaii, controls the committee's business. So when we say we represent the majority, that's what we mean. Each party, the Democrats and Republicans, controls a committee's business and, assigns its own members to the committee, and the majority party controls the business. So when a senator introduces legislation, and you'll see that in the graph with the circle, it is that piece of legislation is referred to the relevant committee of jurisdiction for consideration. And if that bill is taken up and approved by the committee, the bill is sent to the full Senate for further discussion, amendments, and voting. So that is the introduction of a bill and the role that a committee plays in reviewing that bill. So slide 3, you'll see in the United States Senate, there are 24 committees. 16 of the committees are standing committees. 4 are called special committees, and 4 are joint committees. And in the slide, you'll see that Indian Affairs is listed. And in slide number 4, we can move on. The Senate Committee on Indian Affairs is a standing committee, which means it's a permanent body with jurisdiction to draft, consider, and recommend legislation to the full Senate. That is who we are and what we do. And in slide 5, you'll see that a little bit of background on the committee. The committee was initially established as a select committee on Indian Affairs, but it was made permanent in 1984. Our jurisdiction is very broad. We have jurisdiction over American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiian matters generally. And though that jurisdiction includes many things, lands, economies, education, housing, self-governance, and healthcare. And we'll go through a few more of those issue areas later on in the presentation. Moving on to slide 6, what kind of work does the committee do? So whenever a bill triggers the Indian Affairs Committee's jurisdiction, a determination is made by the parliamentarian of the Senate, and it is referred to our committee for further discussion by the committee. The committee selects these bills and gathers input from executive agencies and other experts through formal hearings and other official events. And it meets to perfect the bill through amendments, and then sends the bill to the full Senate for further consideration. What other work do we do? In slide 7, you'll see that the committee, in addition to its broad jurisdiction over legislative matters, we also manage confirmation of presidential nominees. For instance, we confirmed just this Congress the Commissioner for the Administration on Native Americans. We also, as a committee, consider treaties and international agreements. We also hold oversight hearings. Oversight hearings are different than legislative hearings. This is when we focus on implementation and investigation of existing federal laws and programs, or generally matters that affect Native communities. And by way of example, during COVID times, we had several oversight hearings about the impacts of COVID-19 on Native communities across the country. And finally, the committee launches investigations of suspected wrongdoing. We have that authority, but it is very rarely used. So now moving on to the issue areas in our committee. As I mentioned before, our committee's jurisdiction is very broad. We have jurisdiction over land and natural resources, and you'll see on the slide examples of what those are. So leasing and financing, water and energy. And the next slide, you'll see we also have jurisdiction over matters of Native self-governance, self-determination, civil rights, voting. Public safety is also a big issue area that we dive into. Law enforcement in courts, violence against women, homeland security and FEMA matters, as well as military and veterans affairs. So all of these issues really come up in a variety of ways in a legislative hearing or an oversight capacity. And in the next slide, you'll see we also have examples of where we have jurisdiction over economic development matters and infrastructure. The big ones are housing, telecommunication, and transportation. We do a lot of work in those spaces. And last but not least, in the next slide, you'll see there are social issues that we have jurisdiction over: languages, culture, arts, tourism. We have a lot of these social issues that are just really pressing in Native communities across the country, and we do a lot of work in those areas. But in particular, I want to highlight the Native Hawaiian and Alaska Native issues, because there are unique impacts to these particular Native communities as compared to what we call the lower 48, which is the continental United States. For instance, we take a hard look at Hawaiian homelands as they affect the Hawaiian Islands, as well as the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. The other matter that I just want to end with is cultural patrimony. These are international issues. This is when cultural items are held by foreign governments or individuals. Congress passed a law last Congress that would prohibit the export for sale of cultural patrimony, cultural items that are sacred to Native communities in the United States. So with that, that's just sort of an overview of the committee, our legislative work, our oversight work, the issue areas that we grapple with on a daily basis. And I want to hand it over to my colleague Amber to talk about the membership on the committee, as well as the leadership of Brian Schatz and Lisa Murkowski. Take it away, Amber.
Let's use this one. Thank you, Jennifer. My name is Amber Ebarb. I'm the Minority Staff Director for Vice Chairman Lisa Murkowski. I'm Tlingit from Alaska, raised in Anchorage, and my Tlingit name is Jendukla. I'm a member of the Klenati clan in Angoon, Alaska. My family's from Hoona, and my father is he's a member of the Wishkitan clan, so that makes me a child of the Wishkitan. So I just wanted to introduce myself and my background before I launch into the substance of the committee. So Jennifer went over the topics and the issue areas and the history, but I think the membership of the committee is just important. So we can jump to the next slide, which gets to the members, the Republicans and the Democrats who are currently on the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. So this slide, you can see the 6 Republicans and the 6 Democrats and the 5 Republicans. On the left is Chairman Schatz, and on the right is Vice Chairman Lisa Murkowski. Each Congress, senators make a choice on which committees they'd like to serve on. And Senator Murkowski, for her entire time in the Senate, has selected the Indian Affairs Committee because she considers it one of the most important committees in the Senate, given the substance that we address and all the issue areas that Jennifer went over. On the Republican side, we have a number of senators from the West, and similarly on the Democratic side, we have a number of senators from the West, but unique to our committee, the Alaska and Hawaii connection is very important to understand. Throughout the history of the Senate, we've had a priority of educating our colleagues about federal Indian law and policy, but just as important is understanding the uniqueness of Alaska Native issues and Native Hawaiian issues, because they are distinct from Indian country issues and the traditional Indian law policy issues that some of our experts in the field of federal Indian law are more familiar with. So while we educate our peers and our colleagues and congressional staff about Indian lands and people and the federal trust responsibility, we also do that work as it relates to Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians. Another thing that we're very focused on in the 117th and the 118th Congress, I started on the committee 2 years ago in the 117th Congress when Senator Murkowski became vice chairman, and we sat down and wanted to strategize with Chairman Schatz about what the priorities would be for the committee. And one of the values that we have, and Senator Murkowski has set out for her staff, that we try to follow is this commitment to bipartisanship and making sure that we make good policy for all Native people, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian peoples. So we're continuing on that, and as Chairman Schatz charts the path for the direction of the committee, we like to do that in a collaborative fashion with our counterparts, Jennifer and all of my colleagues here. We have a very good collaborative relationship for a Senate committee. We're always looking for the path of common ground that benefits the most Native people. And so I think that takes me to the next slide, which is a little bit of an exploration of the current Senate Committee on Indian Affairs leadership, Vice Chairman Lisa Murkowski and Chairman Schatz. We have focused over the last couple years on, at the beginning of the 117th Congress, we focused on COVID relief and economic development and the Violence Against Women Act, infrastructure investment, and making sure that Indian country, Native communities, Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians were not left out of any of those opportunities as they move forward throughout the Senate and through the House. So we're proud of our accomplishments. Maddie will talk about many of those things, but it also brings me back to this longer running relationship that we have with Hawaii. And one of the things that I was marveling with my colleagues and my friends in Southeast Alaska last week was the launch of the Polynesian Voyaging Society's Moana Nui Kea voyage, which started in Juneau. They did a heritage voyage up to Yakutat and commemorated the gifts from the Sea Alaska Corporation, which is the Alaska Native Corporation for the Tlingit Haida and Sipsian people, created after INCSA in 1971. I'm from Southeast Alaska, as I mentioned earlier, and some of my friends were involved in the donation of the 2 logs that were used for the Hawaii Loa in the 1990s. So we were very honored to be a part of that, this return back to Juneau in Southeast Alaska. I think it's a really strong demonstration of the kinship, of the friendship, and the bond that we have from Alaska and Hawaii. And so I want to thank everyone who has been following that. I think it's so important that we're committed to understanding each other and building on that longstanding friendship that we have with each other. And another one that Len and I talk a lot about is Native languages and our efforts for revitalization. We've had a number of Native language teachers come up back to Alaska after going to Hilo and learning about language programs and revitalization efforts and teaching. And so we're very grateful for the learning and the knowledge that has been shared. Kune, Clarence Twitchell, is one of the leaders in Alaska on native language revitalization. And so we're very grateful for this connection that we have. So it's something that's cultural and personal, but it also plays a role in the way that we interact on the committee and the connection that we have and our commitment to advancing good policy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lena to build on some of this historical relationship between Alaska and Hawaii.
Hi, my name is Lena Aoki, and I've been on the committee for quite a while, and one of the topics that I wanted to talk about a little bit was the history. When I first joined the committee, I actually was at the very end of Senator Inoue's chairmanship of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. And after doing some other work, I came back, and I was also with Senator Akaka when he was chair, and now with Senator Schatz. So the state of Hawaii and the Hawaiian people have a very, very proud history at the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and a very unique contribution in that Hawaii is the only state where 3 of our chairs have been from the state of Hawaii since the founding of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs as a permanent committee. So when I look back at what Senator Inoue was able to do, very groundbreaking accomplishments. I think it's for the first time that many people even understood the relationship between indigenous people in the United States, and that American Indians and Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians shared very strong traditions, cultures, and experiences. Some of the remarkable things that he was able to accomplish included the Native American Language Act, which was really for the first time the U.S. Had a policy in favor, in support of Native languages, instead of the policies that they'd previously had, which were really policies to destroy and undermine Native Hawaiian languages, other Native American languages, and culture. The other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit is that the tradition of having the committee be bipartisan was very much championed by Senator Inoue. As many of you all know, one of his best friends in the world, and including in the Senate, was a senator from Alaska by the name of Senator Ted Stevens. And so I think he naturally understood the importance of bipartisanship, but particularly when we're talking about Native American issues. A lot of people think that there are many people out to get Native Americans or American Indians, Alaska Natives, or Native Hawaiians. My experience has been more of benign neglect when it comes to the Congress and the Senate and the House. And so I think that what Senator Inoue was able to do was really turn that around. And he turned it around in, allowing some of his measures to be heard by the Senate and by the House, but also by being a great advocate within the Senate, within the walls of the Senate. So not just in public hearings and forums like that. He also traveled all over Indian country, all over Hawaii and Alaska, so that he was able to learn as much as he could. And he is very proud of having, so many listening sessions. And he was very famous for just letting people talk. And from a staff perspective, this was a very unwanted situation, because we would be there for hours and hours and hours. And though he had the bladder made of steel, all of us did not share that quality. So, but he was known to hold 6-7 hour listening sessions all around the country. To bring it forward a little bit to Senator Akaka, as many of you know, the only Native Hawaiian to serve in the Senate and to serve in this position of great honor, to be the chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee. He was really an ambassador, I think, for Native Hawaiian culture before joining the leadership of the committee. But certainly while he was there, every time we had a hearing or an event, he stayed for sometimes an hour afterwards to greet all of the panelists and any of the Native peoples that had traveled from all over to come to Washington, D.C. And I think the true affection and the love and the feeling of community that he aspired was very important in that he brought a lot of Hawaii and aloha to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. The other thing I'd want to mention is that he really changed the narrative of the way that really in the federal context we discuss Native Hawaiians. Prior to his chairmanship, there were a lot of people and a lot of individuals who would always say Native Hawaiians were different, they were separate, they're not like Indians, they're not like Alaska Natives. There was no government, so since the government had not been reorganized, they weren't a tribe, and therefore, they weren't worthy of any programs or activities of the federal government. And he completely turned that on its head. He stated very clearly that Native Hawaiian people and the Native Hawaiian community were federally recognized by the federal government as a people, as a community, and that there was a federal trust responsibility going back hundreds of years. The same federal trust responsibility that is talked about in the context of the constitutional power for Congress to make plenary to make laws affecting Indians and Native Americans, the same trust responsibility that the federal government, its bureaus and agencies and those entities owe, it's very much the same as to what Native Hawaiian community is owed by the federal government. And so I think that when we talk about whether or not there are differences between Native Hawaiians, yes, there is a difference because there's not been a reorganized tribal government, but that impacts only one part of the federal relationship, and that is the government-to-government relationship. And most of the programs, of the federal programs that benefit Indians and Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians are based on the trust responsibility. So whether it's education or housing, social services, health, all of those things are based on the trust responsibility. And so I think that Senator Akaka was really able to change the narrative and to talk about American Indians and Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians in the same breath. And it made a difference, I think, over time with his colleagues. And it has now become really the policy of the federal government in statements by Department of Justice, by Department of Interior, and various agencies. That is the narrative. That is the narrative when it's used about Native Hawaiians. Finally, and just to say a few words about Senator Schatz, I think he came in at a time when a lot of things had changed. And so the great leaders that we had from Hawaii and the power that they held in terms of their tenure, in terms of their committee jurisdiction, their assignments. The last couple of years, even with Senator Inoue and Senator Akaka, those powers had diminished. And so I think with Senator Schatz, what he's really brought to the Indian Affairs Committee and really brought forward a lot of the issues with Native Hawaiians is parity in treatment. It's not a question of whether or not Native Hawaiians deserve this or deserve that vis-a-vis American Indians and Alaska Natives. There's no argument. Now the goal and his actions are based on achieving parity when appropriate. It's not always appropriate because Native Hawaiians have not reformed a government, but in every other instance, when it is appropriate, he has been the champion, as have the other delegation members of Hawaii, to try to move forward Native Hawaiian issues. And so I'll just leave it at that and then turn it over to Manu, who will talk about some of the specific accomplishments and some of the things that we've been able to do together as a committee.
Thank you so much, Lena. It's a really hard act to follow. So I'll kind of dive into what has been accomplished for the Native Hawaiian community over the last 2.5 years since Chairman Schatz, or I should say Senator Schatz, took the gavel and Senator Murkowski took the vice chairmanship. And I'll also just add that a lot of this work would not be possible without the support of folks, throughout the committee. I think as Amber said, we really work together. We have our Democrat hats and our Republican hats, but on the committee, and especially under the leadership of Senators Schatz and Murkowski, we're really all kind of working in the same direction to make sure that the Native Hawaiian community has the federal resources that it is owed. So, if Dasan, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, I'll go through a couple of, and the next one, please. Perfect. So I think it's really important to highlight that over the last 2.5 years, we've been able to, I shouldn't say, well, yes, us all working together, but under Senator Schatz and Senator Murkowski's leadership, we've been able to really shepherd through the most dedicated funding ever for the Native Hawaiian community from the federal government. As Lena mentioned, there are sort of 3 pillars that we think about when it comes to Native Hawaiian serving programs. There are others throughout the federal government, but there's Native Hawaiian education, Native Hawaiian healthcare, and Native Hawaiian housing funding that are sort of these 3 pillars. And over the last 2.5 years, we've gotten millions, hundreds of millions of dollars for these initiatives. So as you see on the slide up ahead, $200+ million for Native Hawaiian education, including $170 million for the Native Hawaiian education program. That's not including additional funding for native language revitalization, for which Hawaiians have secured a lot of funding as well. Almost $70 million for Native Hawaiian healthcare. That's Papa'ololokahi, the Native Hawaiian healthcare systems, but in addition, other organizations that serve Native Hawaiian health needs in the behavioral health space, just kind of across the healthcare space. We were able to get almost $55 million for Native Hawaiian housing. That's for the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, but also CNHA was actually hugely instrumental in administering or helping to put out $5 million in emergency rental assistance funding. And that came about due to the pandemic, but really kind of set an example for what the Native Hawaiian community can do when given resources from the federal government. We also got DHHL access to a couple of new programs at the Department of Treasury, including for homeowners assistance. That came about, as a result of the pandemic as well. And then also just wanted to highlight that there were $2 million that the Native Hawaiian community got through the Native Act, which Senator Schatz introduced and saw passed into law in 2016. This funding is kind of changing the game for Native Hawaiian tourism, cultural tourism opportunities, and sort of building on the work that's coming all from you guys to really make sure that visitors coming to Hawaii aren't just visiting a place. They're visiting a place with people, with history, with culture, and our help to understand that. Next slide, please, Dasan. Okay, cool. We also were able to see a bunch of new dedicated funding for the Native Hawaiian community over the last 2 years. So $90 million for broadband deployment on Hawaiian homelands, making sure that Native communities are connected and able to use high-speed internet. $25 million for Native Hawaiian climate resiliency and adaptation funding for the first time ever. That came about through the Inflation Reduction Act, and I think this is sort of one of Senator Schatz's priorities as well, to make sure that we're listening to Native communities who have lived on their lands for thousands of years, who best know how to live in the environments that they're from. We were able to secure new public safety resources as well. $3 million for a new Native Hawaiian Resource Center on domestic violence, and additionally a technical fix to make sure that Native Hawaiian organizations are able to serve Native Hawaiian survivors in their own communities. Senator Schatz and Senator Murkowski also were very pleased and proud to see 2 landmark Native languages laws that they introduced and co-sponsored, enacted into law. That's the Native American Language Resource Center Act, which sets out to create a resource center that's national to help Native communities glean best practices for Native language revitalization. And as Amber kind of mentioned, a lot of that work has been done back in Hawaii, particularly at UH Hilo. So really excited to see that go through. They also were able to get past the Durban Feeling Native American Languages Act, and that sort of follows up on what Lena had mentioned, the Native American Languages Act, which passed in 1990, and redirected the policy of the federal government to really support Native language revitalization. Since that time, over 30 years ago, there really hasn't been a federal evaluation of the state of Native American language revitalization, and really how those federal resources and federal tools are helping to do that work. So excited to see that sort of that health check of Native language revitalization efforts really being carried out. And then additionally, we were able to get past new behavioral health resources for Native communities. This is a new program, not currently funded, but really a foot in the door to make sure that the whole federal government, including the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and the Department of Health and Human Services, is doing work for Native communities. I think for the Native Hawaiian community, this new authority is important from a parity aspect as well. This new resource is meant to serve American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. And I think there's, as kind of Lena was mentioning, there are, of course, cultural differences, there are differences in political status between and amongst these communities, but a lot of times there are similar issues that American Indians, that Alaska Natives, that Native Hawaiians face. So I think we're building on, we hope to build on this new authority, hope to get it funded, and really with your help, hope to have a successful model for deployment of these resources for the Native Hawaiian community. And then from a committee standpoint, we've been really pleased under Senator Schatz and Senator Murkowski's leadership to have welcomed over 20 Native Hawaiian witnesses and panelists to testify and participate in committee hearings and roundtables over the last 2.5 years. I think this really speaks to Senator Schatz's prioritization of amplifying Native Hawaiian voices in relevant and meaningful ways. And I just want to say that yes, representation is hugely important. It's important for, at the federal level, folks to be reminded that Native Hawaiians are a part of the conversation. But I think also those witnesses, those panelists that have appeared before the committee, they've led to other substantive policymaking improvements. And I'm just going to cite the example of Mark Patterson, who is the administrator for Kawailoa Youth and Family Wellness Center. He came and he testified before the committee during our public safety hearing last May. And as a result of his remarkable work in this space, and we got to also visit with him at his facility, was able to be appointed to, and I wrote it down so I don't get it wrong, the Coordinating Council on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention as a representation of Native Americans on this council. This appointment is made by the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs chairman with the concurrence of the vice chairman. So I just wanted to bring up that example to demonstrate that it's not just lip service. It's not just having people come and talk before the committee and then they go home and we go about our business. I think a lot of this participation is really informing the work that that we all do as staff and that our bosses do as members. So thank you so much. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to, I believe, Brianne, who will sort of be covering what we're doing in the committee this Congress and going forward.
Aloha mai kako. I'm Brianna Uhiva, and actually this is the point at which we transition to some of the big pieces of legislation that we're working on currently. So I think it'd be a good breaking point if folks have questions about the overview that we just gave of who we are, what we do, and what we've been doing up until this point. So we're happy to take any questions that anyone might have before we move on. Oh, there's a question back there.
Thank you guys for everything you guys are currently doing and have done in the past. Like for me, I hear a lot of misnomers, and that's only because the history that I subscribe to is that there was never a law that would give Congress the power to annex, to unilaterally annex another country, right? And so we're illegally occupied. So while you guys are, using the laws that have been passed to the benefit of Americans and Native Hawaiians, appreciate what you guys have done. But is there any conversation about, illegally occupying another country?
I will say the answer to that question is always yes. That conversation is always at the forefront in terms of understanding the very unique situation of Native Hawaiians. There is an apology resolution acknowledging the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And I've worked in this space, specifically in the governance and recognition space, for many years now. And my observation, having worked in the Native Hawaiian community, having worked in the federal government now, is that these are all conversations that should be robust and ongoing at the same time. Because the question of international law is something that should be pursued, but while that is being pursued aggressively, there's also the question of what the federal government has done, things described in the apology resolution and elsewhere that has been acknowledged. There's funding, there are programs that are meant to address some of those actions, and to leave all of those on the table while pursuing another legal conversation, to me is something that gets the federal government off the hook a little bit in a way that we as a committee try to make sure is not happening in terms of the federal government's responsibility, its trust responsibility, as Lena described, to ensure that its interaction with the Native Hawaiian community is a fiduciary relationship, is an interaction where the federal government is always seeking activities and actions in the best interest of the Native Hawaiian community. And that's a big part of the role that we play here. But those big governance questions, I will say, as you can imagine, the Native Hawaiian community is not alone among Native communities in looking at the way the federal government has interacted with the community in terms of land, in terms of political authority. And so these are questions that are not only happening in the Native Hawaiian space, they're happening elsewhere as other Native communities try to understand their political position vis-a-vis the United States, within the international community. And so it's our position that all those conversations should be ongoing and happening at the same time. While conversations are happening between the Native Hawaiian community in the international space, we work on the federal level to ensure that the federal conversation doesn't get dropped, and that those responsibilities and those resources don't fall through the cracks, while folks are having important conversations about other spaces and other authorities.
Brianne, thank you so much for that explanation, super clear. And also to just say that I want to add to that CNHA has always been an advocate for engaging at the federal level. And I will say it's not either or, it's both and, right? That we need to pursue both, and to Brianne's point, that there are many other efforts going on as well. But we have, the United States does have a responsibility for what you described because of the illegal overthrow. So do we just walk away from that completely and say, you did bad and we're pursuing something else? I think it's both and. And so I thank you for that very thorough answer and explanation. Other questions, and I will walk to you with the mic so the rest of the audience can hear. Does anybody else have? Thanks.
Quick question. I'm from Oregon. I've lived on the continent for over 35 years now, originally from Honolulu. This is the first time that I've heard from representatives about the synergies between Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians working together in government. And I love the way you broke it down. How does someone like me, I'm just, in my first couple years being involved in Hawaiian Civic Club, how can I share this, what you've shared with us? And how do other people that are not at convention, that don't have access to attend sessions like this, to hear this story and be able to connect to it and, kind of trace our lineage back through I'm thinking, wow, I remember when Okaka was in office. I remember when Noe was in office, and I wasn't even living in Hawaii. So being able to connect to it that way, I think is really important to me. But I'm thinking about how can other people identify with this. I have nieces and nephews who are born in diaspora. They know nothing of their Hawaiian-ness because they haven't lived on the island. So maybe this is a way that they can get engaged, especially for, my nieces and nephews are older now, but Opio coming up now. How can we engage them to be more active in this space, even though they may not feel like they belong in this space, to have this kind of voice, unless it comes with anger and awareness of injustice? You know what I mean? I think there's something missing there, and how can we work together to market this in a different way, outside of this? So that's one of my questions for you.
And I'm actually going to turn that over to our moderator because we actually anticipated that there might be questions about how to become more engaged. And I think you saw when Amber was going through the list of senators who sit on our committee that there are representatives from the state of Washington, from Nevada, which I know is of particular importance here. And so those senators and their staff bring issues from their home offices to our committee. We take them very seriously. When there's local issues, we tend to be very deferential to the home state senators because they know and they're connected to community and they understand more than some of us might about what's going on in their areas. But I think the real point of interaction is groups like CNHA, civic clubs like you described. It's a community-driven policy engine, and we engage those groups, and we engage individual citizens as well, and love to hear from the community about different policy needs. But we really do rely heavily on policy experts who are community connected to bring the issues to us so that we can do our work on the legal level and the policy level, but we're always deferring to the expertise of the actual community because we don't want to do something at the federal level that we think is a great idea from 30,000 feet up, but when we're looking at the ground, it's just not going to work for the community. It's not going to address the issue that we're trying to address with it. So we do defer very heavily to groups that are actually working in that space, and I'll pass it over to Michelle.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's our kuleana, right? They're carrying their kuleana. They're in DC on our behalf. They've done their half. The other half is that we do our share, that we choose to engage, that we choose to plug in. Nobody's gonna spoon feed to us the information that we need. We have to be engaged. I think one of the things growing up in Hawaii that we've lost faith because of the illegal overthrow, because there's been a disconnection from Aina, because there's still a lot of deep historical trauma, that our notion has been that we disconnect. That rather than leaning in and further connecting, we chose to disconnect. And we said, politics is not for me. We don't engage in that. But when we don't engage, all of the wonderful things that actually happen, we don't know about, we don't learn about, and then we don't lean in. And so the responsibility is back on us, that what is the next 10, 20, 30 years of our lahui going to look like? They can only do so much. They're doing their part by being in DC. Now we have to do our part. We need to plug in. We need to understand. And as a result, we will learn more and more about the history, what's happening on the Hill, and how we can be a bigger part of it. So we're not saying it's never too late, even if they're grown up, right? We all have kuleana. Sometimes we choose our kuleana, and sometimes our kuleana chooses us. But it's our turn to lean in so that we can make the changes for our people and for our lahui that we'd like to see. You were going to say something, Lena?
Yeah, I was just going to add this. One of the things that I think is really important is to go to the core, right? What do Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians have in common? And, you know, sometimes people use those terms like there really is such a thing as an Indian, which we all know Columbus didn't know where he was going. And so there really isn't something called an Indian. When we talk about when Indigenous people talk about themselves, they don't call themselves an Indian or an Alaska Native or Native Hawaiian. In almost every Native language, they call themselves the people, right? They don't call themselves a name that was, you know, derived from something in Europe or whatever. And so when we think of the Constitution, one of the things that I always recommend to young people and to anybody is to think of it very generally. When the Constitution, it has a clause, and it gives Congress the plenary power to make laws regarding Indian tribes, okay? That is a legal term. Indian, as we said earlier, doesn't exist. Tribe is a European word to describe a community of people, right? So to break it down, what that really means is Congress has the power to make plenary decisions, laws, right, policies regarding Indigenous people who formed governments prior to the US government and exercise sovereignty over lands that are now a part of the United States. If you look at it that way, you don't break it into them, us, we, them, whatever. It's Indigenous people of the United States. And it's because of that political relationship that Indigenous people had governments. They formed governments. They exercised sovereignty over their people, over their lands. They made laws with regard to their people and their lands. And that predates the US government. And so that's the important thing to understand. So whether Hawaii or Alaska became states in 1959 or whatever, there are certain things that apply to that, certain negative aspects, because there are federal policies that came into existence over time that were more and more and more negative to Indigenous people. But really what it is that as long as those Indigenous people, those groups, exercise sovereignty over lands that are now a part of the United States, whether they became a part of the United States in 1959 or before, that is the important aspect that we all should look at. Thank you.
You have a question? Sterling, in the front, we have another question. And Brianne, just let me know when we should.
Thanks for the Schoolhouse Rock Light version of how a bill gets passed. But okay, so I have two questions. The first is, can we please extend the Ho'ihi grant to like Friday since we're all here and really busy? No? Okay, second question is,
No.
so like, the real question is, so super easy to come and ask you guys for money, right? Like, you could pull a number out of thin air, like $6 billion for housing, I need it tomorrow. And I think finding advocates on our end is really easy, right? We can mobilize the community. And I think the difficulty is, I don't know how to find $6 billion in like, on the federal side, and I don't think that's helpful to you folks to just come in with a number. So I think in terms of, since we're talking about process, can you folks explain how to find the money so that we can be more effective advocates when we make those kinds of asks of you guys?
So, there's multiple answers, I think, to your question, depending on what kind of money you're looking for. And we're going to be talking in a second about 3 big pieces of legislation that we're working on. And the one that I'm most actively managing is the Farm Bill process. And there has been a real ask from all over the country, Native communities all over the country, that exact same question. we're not even certain we need more money. We can't even find the money that's already there, right, is what people are telling us. So we're actively trying to work with agencies to develop navigation services, technical assistance, so that there's outreach to Native communities saying, hey, are you aware that there's tons of environmental justice money that's specifically for Native communities? Because the answer is usually no. I mean, even when it comes to us, we're pleasantly surprised to hear that there's all this money for Native communities. And so that is a real need. We've identified it not on our own, but with Native communities coming to us and asking us about it. So that's an area we're really trying to work in, and we think can really maximize the benefit of these programs, because some of that money just goes unspent, right? Because it can't get to the intended recipient. And then beyond that, when folks find the money, we're talking about people who work in those fields, right? People who work in agriculture, people who work in education or healthcare. They're not professional grant writers. They're competing with the state of California to try to get this money, right? And so we've heard that as well. We need more technical assistance on grant writing, and then even grant compliance, all the reporting that comes with a federal grant and things like that. So those are things we're all very actively working on. In terms of asks for programs that don't exist, I'm a big advocate of just asking. You know, they're all new programs came from an idea, and the funding gets worked out, as we all know, and that's something that happens between senators, which actually, for me, raises one more point I wanted to make with regard to Native Hawaiians on the continent. We have 2 senators from Hawaii, but they cannot work in a vacuum. So if they are also hearing about Native Hawaiian issues from the senators from Nevada, from the senators from Utah, from the senators from California and Washington State, all of a sudden Native Hawaiian issues are national issues, and national issues get national attention. You know, so I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind as you're working on advocacy in that space, that there's an actual benefit to having Native Hawaiians active on the continent for Native Hawaiian issues at home and here. So I think those are the things that I would recommend in working on those issues. And we will go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what we're doing right now. And I'm going to pass it over to Darren and Jacqueline.
Hey everybody, for those of you who came in a little bit later, my name is Darren Modulewski. I serve as a policy advisor to Senator Schatz on the committee. And if we could turn to that Indian Arts and Crafts Act slide, Dasan. Yeah. I just wanted to do a quick review of one of the number of bills we're working on this Congress and sort of actively exploring. The first one is the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. For those of you who aren't familiar with it or maybe who haven't heard of it before, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, or IACA, is generally, it's a truth in advertising law to protect Indian arts and crafts. It was passed in 1935. And part of the purpose of the act was to promote economic development among Indian peoples, and they use the word wards, but Indian people and tribes. Since that the act created a board that had a number of authorities. One of them was to issue patents and trademarks of authenticity to protect and acknowledge crafts and arts products of indigenous communities as authentic, to prevent counterfeiting. So that's why I say it's often a truth in advertising law. So the act is designed to protect against fraud. Since its passage in 1935, the bill's been amended 3 times, 1990, 2000, 2010. The most recent amendment is actually pretty interesting. It's the series of amendments to try to update the law, because it was first passed in 1935, so it was a little different concept of what Indian art is, how it operates, who's doing it. And the 2010 amendments really sort of looked at enforcement in a very meaningful way and changed the penalties. The criminal and civil and criminal penalties on the criminal side increased penalties from $500 to up to $5 million, and added jail time up to 15 years. So it took very seriously fraudulent production of native goods. And then, those amendments were trying to update the act, and I think, Congress was doing the best that it could at the time. Over the last 4 years, the committee has heard quite a bit about the changing landscape of Indian arts, Indian production, native arts, native crafts, and the panoply of places where it's sold, how it's produced, the format formats that it's produced in. And as a result of that feedback, Senator Schatz developed what's called the discussion draft. And this kind of goes back to Jennifer's point about one of the roles of the committee in drafting legislation. And so in this case, Senator Schatz has put forward a discussion draft for review by Indian country, by Native Hawaiians, to try to, again, update the Indian Arts and Crafts Act to make it more relevant for today. And so there's a couple highlights on the screen. The first one that I'd sort of point out is that it adds Native Hawaiians, or Native Hawaiian produced arts and crafts as an element of or a protected group of items or objects within the Act. So currently the Act applies to descendants of Indian tribes, right? It excludes Native Hawaiians. And so this is sort of an issue, right? I mean, you all know the issues on the islands. And so the discussion draft inserts and includes Native Hawaiians and Native Hawaiian produced arts and crafts. The other thing it does is it significantly expands the enforcement. And in this case, it allows law enforcement officers to issue subpoenas, interact with Border Patrol and Customs to seize vessels that are coming in with fraudulently produced arts and crafts. It does a whole bunch of really kind of interesting things on the criminal side. And then the last thing that I highlight is that it creates a grant program that would put some of the money that it raises through civil asset forfeiture back into, and the way it's drafted is into BIE schools. And once the draft was released, about 2 months ago, we had a listening session, and then it took comments from Indian country until about May 19th. Tomorrow we're going to have another listening session to hear from you all about the ways the bill can be improved to specifically address issues facing Native Hawaii, or facing Hawaii. Especially with Hawaii being sort of a waypoint for the importation of fraudulently produced goods, and make sure that the goods that are and arts that are produced by Native Hawaiians benefit the Native Hawaiian community. And so this tomorrow will be a kind of a neat way for us to learn from you all on how to improve that bill. I think at that, I mean, I can take a question or two, but really I think I should just turn it over to Jacqueline, and she'll talk about the boarding school bill that we've been working on.
Thank you, Darren. Dasan, can you flip to the... Again, I'm Jacqueline Basili, Policy Advisor and Press Secretary for Senator Murkowski, who's Vice Chairman on the committee. And I'll be talking to you about the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools Act of 2023. For the first bullet's simply an overview, a background, and the current status of the legislation. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the bill that has been introduced. This will be the third introduction since its first, receipt in the Senate in the 116th Congress. It's based off of the federal boarding school policies that the federal government instituted in the early 1800s against Native children by forcing them to attend boarding schools, day schools, or other sorts of institutions in order to assimilate them from their Native cultures and languages and families. Going from that, the federal government supported or implemented or operated any type of these institutions for nearly 150 years. So we still have a lot of survivors, their descendants, and families still living from these schools. Over time, we know that there's a strong history just by family stories, retellings, and just as a community know that this assimilation process has greatly affected Native people across the country, in Alaska and Hawaii as well, in the loss of Native languages and cultures, which Congress, as we've previously talked about, have been trying to overturn and reinstitute and build back up these Native languages and cultures. Because of that, also, we kept hearing about the need for a development of some sort of federal commission that could continue to look into this more thoroughly. And it started with Representative Holland when she was on the House side and now Secretary. in a bill that was first introduced in the 116th, and now she instituted an initiative probably about 2 years ago now that looks into this at a federal level. So with her secretarial order, the department began looking into this, and they produced a report last year that started identifying about 408 schools across the country that had been participants in this assimilation policy. Building off of that, the bill that she introduced, that is also introduced in the Senate by Senator Warren, builds this federal commission that's in conjunction with what the Interior is doing. And you kind of go into the highlights, which I'll jump down to, is the commission is now a 5-person commission, and it has its advisory committees and survivors, and as well as a Native American and a federal advisory commission. And with the input of this commission, they will build upon over a number of years through visitations, testimonials, and input received from Native peoples, recommendations that Congress should take in order to help address and heal from the Indian boarding school policies. And then going into what is now introduced, which is S 1723, Senator Warren introduced it last month with 28 senators, including Senator Schatz and Murkowski. When it was introduced last Congress, we had what Jennifer went through is a legislative and oversight hearing on the issue as well as legislation. So with that hearing we had in June, we had a number of witnesses from across the country, from Alaska, from Hawaii, kind of describe their experiences and how it greatly affected their communities. So with that feedback and advice that we received from the hearing, up until about a few months ago, we on the staff, we on the committee, as well as our bosses, worked together in how we could improve this legislation to work better. From that hearing in June 2022, the committee had a markup just a few weeks ago on June 7th, where a Schatz-Murkowski substitute amendment was switched out for the bill that Warren introduced, and that included lots of feedback. I think this was one of the pieces of legislation since I've been on committee where we've had so much input and so much feedback that it took us several months to go through and comb through. We had over 100 comments supplemented just for the statement for the record. We had feedback from tribes, Native leaders, tribal organizations. The main organization that is handling this is nickname is NABS. It's the Native American Boarding School and Healing Reconciliation Coalition. And they have been a true leader in trying to move this bill for a number of years. And so they worked with other stakeholders as well in giving us important improvement in how we can make it better. We had also worked with the administration. Interior, I mentioned, also had the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations help input on the Native Hawaiian aspect of the report, which identified about 408 schools, I said, and 7 were found in Hawaii and 21 in Alaska. But we know that that number can be a lot larger. It's just based off of the schools that the Interior identified in their definition criteria. And that's, we know there's more. And I think this is where the important need for the commission is. Can we go back to the slide? The need for this bill is there's not just 21 schools in Alaska. We've heard from our Alaskan stakeholders who have had many say that it's not just the school that received federal money. They didn't stay overnight. They went to the day schools, or they had some part of criteria that they couldn't meet, so they weren't placed on that list, but they know that they had some family that had went to that school or were sent away even across the country to Pennsylvania at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And maybe they were left there, but they don't know. Also, we have families that don't even know, but maybe through this work, they would be able to identify family that have had their Native children, buried, and they just couldn't find a grave site. So I think the need is very strong, and it's been helpful through this feedback we received in updating the text that the committee received 2 Congresses ago, and that we've been working on it, immensely over the last few months to create this 5-person commission, where you'll see the highlights of the bill is that the members for this commission will come from the nominations of the Native communities themselves. So you have identified leaders probably in your communities who you think would be a great addition to be either a commission member or on one of the advisory committees or advisory subcommittees that we have. And from there, you'll nominate that person to the interior. And then the interior will compile this full list of who they think would be best suited for these roles. And then that list is sent up to Congress, who will work together in a bipartisan way in fulfilling the roles of each of the commission, committees, and subcommittees. And I think this is something like where we keep talking about fulfilling the trust responsibilities, ensuring that it has the accurate input, that the responsibilities are carried out in a respectful manner because you know what's best, you know what is culturally appropriate, you know the do's and don'ts of what will happen during these events. And so I think this is something that we keep reiterating, is that this is a Native commission that was created by Native people in order to fully heal from these atrocities that happened to Native children over many, many years. So we continue to promote the truth and healing through this commission to also allow information. And we've been hearing through feedback by stakeholders who are already doing work in the field now that they cannot access information adequately, or maybe the organization that they want information from can't do it without something called a subpoena. And without the issuance of subpoena to these organizations, they're not able to hand over information that might have some information about more Native children that we don't know about, or information that will specifically help the commission in carrying out its roles and in developing a initial and final report. So the issuance of subpoenas is something that I think was very important to keep in and also strengthen it so that it can help the commission continue to do what it's been designed to do. We also hear about something over the last few months is that there was not enough research and behavioral health, trauma-informed care provided. So we strengthened up those provisions to make sure that the researchers can continue to do their work with more support. And also having attended some of the Road to Healing tour that the administration is doing by Secretary Holland and Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs Brian Newland, that they need actual tribal-informed care providers at these testimonials and these meetings, so that if someone is there to testify and you open up to someone so deeply about something that you or your family experienced and you're sharing their stories, it might open up something that you don't know you had within you. And so having that safe space for someone to go to and talk to someone that is trained to do that also helps. And I think it continues to help to meet those responsibilities of the commission is in providing truth and healing. So providing that truth also gives you that space for the healing. So we designed that to be available for the commission staff, as well as anyone who comes and testifies at one of the in-person or virtual meeting sites. With the commission and its broad authority to look into Indian boarding schools, within the first 4 years, they will have to send out an initial report to the public that discusses its findings and its initial recommendations. And they'll go through regions as well as into Hawaii and Alaska at least twice. They can meet more if it's necessary, and just inform the public about what they found and receive feedback on what they might be missing, what could make it better, because there might be something that they just completely missed and it needs to be included in the report, which would lead to the final report that would be issued within the 6 years that the commission is established for. So for the 6 years in total, it authorizes about $15 million a year in order to carry out all the duties and responsibilities and purposes of the bill. And you will have the time for the initial report, the final report as well as the meetings kind of described in the bill. So if you do want to look at the bill thoroughly, you can go to congress.gov. That's where all of the bills that we've talked about, you can find them within the last few years. The most current, we're now in the 118th Congress, and that bill is S-1723. It was introduced by Senators Warren, but you also have about 28 other senators who are on the bill, and that will lead you to the text that was passed by the committee. I don't think it's quite up yet because they're still typing it in. It's a 133-page document, but it fully lays out the whole purposes, the responsibilities of the commission, nominations, appointments of the commission, and the subcommittees and advisory roles. And then it kind of just lays out what the commission is just designed to do, and then kind of requirements for the reporting, meetings, and funding, and kind of just everything that they need to do. But we've also left open things that they can do on their own without specifically saying that you have to do it. So that will be helpful for you to read more thoroughly too. And we're here to answer those questions as well. Okay, Heather, thank you.
All right, so I think two really important things to take away from what Jacqueline just shared. There's going to be an opportunity for very robust community engagement with the Truth and Healing Commission, and take all of those opportunities to propose members of the commission, to propose individuals with expertise for the subcommittees. These are really where those decisions are made, so it's important to have experts from the Native Hawaiian community be a part of that conversation so that the unique experience of Native Hawaiians in the boarding school process is something that can be addressed. And I think one of the key things that will come out of that commission is bringing a lot of that history into the light, because when we started the conversation, people were asking questions about, okay, well, boarding schools, Hawaii, it's not the same narrative as the continent, right? And every place had its own unique narrative. But there were children taken from Hawaii and brought to the continent to go to these boarding schools. Things like that are not widely known, and there's very odd and sinister connection between some of the boarding schools here and things that were being done in Hawaii. And so it's really important for all of this information, like Jacqueline was sharing, to come out so that we can begin conversations about how to address that harm. And it's part of a bigger effort that our committee has been undertaking for many, many Congresses, but with some extra earnest in the past two Congresses in terms of intergenerational trauma in the space of child welfare and domestic violence. We just had a huge Supreme Court decision come down on the Indian Child Welfare Act last week. Senators Schatz and Murkowski led the congressional amicus brief in that case, which staff worked on very hard with our outside counsel. Just looking at what was happening at that point in time. The boarding schools were happening at the same time that Native children were being adopted out to non-Native families based on these notions of their being raised in their own culture as somehow being inadequate to them being raised in a Western home. And so those are the kinds of things that we're looking at very actively. That actually persists to this day. When we look at adoption rates and placement of children into foster care, there is still evidence of over removal of children based on a misunderstanding of even multi-generational homes, that it's an overcrowded home and not really giving appropriate deference to how a community chooses to live and raise its children. And so those are issues that we work on every day, and the Boarding Schools Commission is a piece of it, but we do a lot of work in that space.
Brian raised a very good point about the inclusion from Hawaii and having representation on these committees, subcommittees, advisory committees. The one thing that I'd flag is that when we'll be optimistic, when the bill is enacted, there's sort of a 90-day window to submit those nominations to the Department of Interior. So if you have an interest in doing that, keep an eye out, watch the bill, track the bill, and then once it's enacted, there's a 90-day window to submit those nominations. So we just don't want you all to miss out on that opportunity.
Right, and we will move to our last major piece of legislation that we're working on, which is the 2023 reauthorization of the U.S. Farm Bill. And this is a process that comes around every 5 years, and it's been happening since 1933, and it's an agriculture bill, but it really kind of guides everything that USDA does everywhere in all of the spaces. So although it's technically an agriculture bill, there are provisions in there that address rural development, telecom, water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, energy development, clean energy development, climate change, biocultural ecosystem restoration, everything you can imagine is part of the Farm Bill. And so we've become very engaged. Last iteration of the reauthorization in 2018 was the first time that Native equities were really very seriously considered and meaningfully addressed in the Farm Bill. It used to just kind of be big crops, and that was their bill, and that's what they were working on. But in 2018, the Native Farm Bill Coalition came together, and they started advocating very strongly for Native-specific equities to be addressed in the Farm Bill. They did a fantastic job. They got over 60 separate provisions for Native communities included in the Farm Bill. Really amazing self-determination provisions, like running their own equivalent, basically, of SNAP programs, the FDIPR program for distribution of food on Indian reservations, really kind of taking control over how communities are fed. Other opportunities for co-management of forest spaces, and a tremendous amount of progress was made in 2018. So the hope for this reauthorization is that we will build on that progress. The Native Farm Bill Coalition is now a well-oiled machine. They were a brand new entity at that time. But of course, at that time, they were just sort of pulling things together from folks who were already working in this space. And so Native Hawaiians were not very actively included in the 2018 process for the Farm Bill reauthorization. And we wanted to make sure that was not going to be the case in the 2023 reauthorization. So we reached out actively to the Native Hawaiian community, to CNHA, to other Native Hawaiian organizations to say, tell us what the stakeholder issues are in the agriculture space so we can make sure to amplify those issues at the federal level and make sure we're working with the Native Farm Bill Coalition to ensure that Native Hawaiian equities are also considered when they're out talking to senators and representatives about the Native equities generally. So it's an amazing process that kind of, to me, ties together a lot of what we've been talking about here, where because there isn't a reorganized government, which is usually an easy one-stop shop for us, when we need to know, for example, what are the issues for Nevada, Native communities in Nevada will go to tribal governments, and they'll come and they have their various different departments, and so they can talk to us about education and healthcare and agriculture. With the Native Hawaiian community, all of that mana'o and wisdom is kind of stored in different spaces, and so we have to actively go out and find the folks who work on agriculture, to find the folks who work on education, to find the folks who work on tourism, and ask for feedback so that we can make sure we're doing the right thing on a federal policy level. So this was an example of that. CNHA had great connections. We worked with Kamehameha Schools as well, who of course works in the agriculture space and has tremendous land holdings, and we asked them to please put us in touch with farmers, ranchers, folks, fishermen, everybody who's working in this space so that we can hear directly from the community about what the needs are in the agriculture space. And it gave birth to a beautiful process where there was community engagement, it was synthesized into policy asks, brought to us, and to me is a really great example of what can be done when folks are active and organized. And so we're in the process right now. Senators Schatz and Murkowski have submitted a list of priorities to the Agriculture Committee, which is a sister committee of ours, on key priorities for both Native Hawaiians and Alaska Natives in the upcoming Farm Bill. And a few that we've identified are equity for Native Hawaiians in program access. Like Lena was saying earlier, parity and equity are words we use often because there are many programs that Native Hawaiians should be eligible for, but no one's ever taken the time to stand up and say, why not Native Hawaiians also? So we're making sure that in the agriculture space, we're standing up and saying, why not Native Hawaiians also? So equity for Native Hawaiians in access to the existing programs of USDA, the grant navigation assistance we talked about earlier, helping someone who is out in the field and has no time to be looking for grants, to find those grants, to apply for those grants, and to successfully get those grants. And that's something that we've heard from all over the place, not just in Hawaii. And the Alaska Federation of Natives did an amazing job by standing up a grant navigator during the CARES Act process in COVID to help Alaska Native organizations find funding and apply for funding and go after funding. So that's been a great model that we're looking toward. Recognizing traditional ecological knowledge is another thing that we've heard a lot from the Native Hawaiian community, but also from other Native communities, just ensuring that when USDA does its activities, that it's making sure that traditional ecological knowledge is appropriately integrated into its standards, what it's requiring, not only of non-Native entities who are doing work that impacts Native communities, but also where Native communities are doing agriculture in a traditional way that might not line up with the federal standards, that there's accommodation and understanding that traditional ecological knowledge should be respected and allowed in the process. Defraying the high cost of shipping, which is something we hear in Alaska and Hawaii often, not just from Native communities, but from everybody. So we're looking into that, seeing what kind of solutions we can find there. Waiving cost share and match requirements. You know, there are a lot of entities that could do amazing work and could win $1 million grant and do something fabulous with it, but when it requires you match it with $1 million, they don't even apply, right? So there's so much that could be happening that's not happening because of these cost prohibitive matches that are required. So we're in every space that we can for the past 2 Congresses, we've been looking to waive those costs so that folks with great ideas can actually get some of this funding and do something fantastic with it. And then looking at productive repurposing of unused agricultural lands. There's so much of that, you know, back home, and we're wanting to make sure that land, that folks have the opportunity to take that land, do restoration, use it for productive purposes as the community sees fit. And so that's also another priority that's been raised to us. And it's a really interesting space. I was not an agriculture person when I came to the committee. We all have our assignments, and some of those areas we consider ourselves to be experts in, and others we do because we've been asked to do them. So agriculture was a space that I came into on the committee, but it's been a really fascinating space to work in. And looking at food sovereignty and the connection between food sovereignty and political sovereignty. Not to shout out Netflix or anything, but I was watching Taste of the Nation, and they had an episode on Puerto Rico, and they were talking about independence. And they said, how can we talk about political independence when we rely on the United States for 80% of our food? You know, those are the questions that true independence, true sovereignty, controlling your food, controlling land and spaces, those are the issues that we face and we're looking at specifically in the context of the Farm Bill. So we're very eager to continue getting feedback from the community. The Farm Bill is still in the process of being drafted, so if you have brilliant ideas for us, we love those, and please reach out to any of us on the committee with those ideas. And those are the 3 big things we're working on. So we'll take questions.
Hi, I'm Leilani. I'm from San Diego. I'm born and raised on Oahu. I just want to say thank you for all the work you do. And, you know, I have my daughter here. She's 13 years old. And, you know, they learn about how a bill becomes a law in 5th grade, 6th grade, and 7th grade. So as her mother, even though I live in San Diego, I know it's my responsibility to teach her how to advocate. Even though we're on the continent, you know, I want to make sure she understands the process and the path for Native Hawaiian independence and self-determination. So you being here and her being able to listen to you folks is a privilege. So I thank you for that. I also want to say, you know, I'm a social worker for 26 years and did work in Hawaii and, you know, have been living in San Diego as a social worker, working with kids with severe trauma from birth to age 5. 70% of my caseload is child welfare. and the ICWA bill I had tracked, because for 10 years working in San Diego and seeing those fast adoptions and working with Native American children and thinking about my kuleana as a Native Hawaiian to support other Natives when things are being done unjustly in the child welfare system, it was my duty to speak up and make sure those Native children were protected no matter where I'm at. So I'm just grateful that you folks were able to advocate and get ICWA, supported. So I just appreciate you folks for that. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. I don't know exactly, does anybody have a time check? It's 2:43, so I think it starts at 2:45, the next workshop. So you have 2 minutes to go to the next workshop that you're interested in joining. Thank you. Mahalo.